Imagine taking a shower, but instead of coming out clean, you come out with rashes. Then, you decide to drink some water from the tap, but drinking it makes you gag in disgust and sets you in the hospital just a few hours later. Well, this is the reality in the Indigenous Reserve of Neskantaga, along with 72% of all First Nations water systems across Canada today. But how did all this happen? What led to these events? And why won't the government do anything about it? So this all began in 1534. The European colonization of North Americas aimed to take control over the territory, natural resources, and people, such as the First Nations. Through a series of battles between the British and the French, most prominently with the 7 Years' War, the British gained control over vast areas of the East Coast and interior. Initially, Indigenous communities were welcome and were friendly with the non-Native Americans. With things such as the fur trade, Indigenous groups actively participated and traded with the European colonizers. In a few rarer cases, Europeans and the Indigenous even mixed and created new identities, like the Métis. As time went on, however, diseases and continued European expansions further threatened Indigenous groups. Despite treaties with First Nation communities and laws prohibiting the takeover of their lands, these treaties were constantly challenged and then ignored. Along with this, the colonizers were often aimed at creating a homogeneous community and saw the First Nations peoples as beneath them. The Indian Act was the primary law installed to limit Indigenous peoples and assimilate them. The Act banned religious ceremonies, cultural gatherings, dancing, soliciting funds, the right to vote, movement, and lots of others. The Indian Act itself is still enforced today, and only began a shift towards non-discrimination in 1951. Another aspect of repression were the reserves. Originating around the 19th century, they began as a means of establishing more solid borders between Indigenous communities and colonizers. Despite how fair these initial treaties seemed, often First Nations were forced to settle with less fertile, likely rugged terrain that was less valued, which were further constricted through several policies that not only shrink these reserves, but also removed Indigenous rights to many resources. Additional legislation within the 20th century led to a limit for Indigenous peoples to move around, as well as their rights to fish or hunt. Although many of these laws have since been retracted, the impacts of the old reserve system still remain in the form of poverty and neglect.
I want to be able to turn on my tap and drink the water.
Despite clean water being accessible in most areas of Canada, many First Nations communities continue to suffer from unclean water supply and rely on boiling water or even using other sources of water for drinking. The water systems in Canada, in a sense, are quite urbanly focused. Hence, most areas with water issues are located somewhat far away from major cities like Montreal, Toronto, or Vancouver. Water advisories are typically only 3 to 4 days long. However, in many First Nations communities, this lasts for months, sometimes even multiple years. Before we get into the situation Indigenous First Nations are currently in, let's look at the definition of a boil water advisory. A boil water advisory, or similar terms such as a boil water notice, boil water warning, boil water order, or boil order, is a public health advisory or directive issued by governmental or other health authorities to consumers when a community's drinking water is or could be contaminated by pathogens. The Neskantaga Reserve to this day faces a boil water advisory. In their case, this is caused by the lingering parasites, viruses, bacteria, and heavy metals that cannot be killed or filtered with the aging water system that was built. All the water they use must first be boiled. This means that taking a bath requires around 3 hours of just boiling water in pots. Showers are literally impossible. Effectively, all of the residents of Neskantaga rely on bottled water instead of tap for drinking, cooking, wetting their toothbrush, and so on, risking illness otherwise. While the rest of the country has the commodity of using water from the tap freely, that is, excluding most Indigenous reserves of course, This leads to over 300,000 Canadian dollars spent annually just by purchasing bottled water for the Neskantaga First Nation reserve. The worst part? It has been like this since 1995, or 30 years. Well, the very root lies in the Canadian government itself. 400 out of 618 First Nations were under at least one water advisory between 2004 and 2014. If 2/3 of a metropolitan area like Vancouver were under water advisory, it'd be considered a citywide emergency. Officials have commented on the water situation, with Michael Burrows bluntly stating, quote, "Frankly, people should be living in other places." This callous response is extremely concerning, highlighting just how little the government actually cares. They are blatantly disregarding the land upon which Indigenous peoples have spent millennia living in and caring for, suggesting them to move someplace else, like urban areas, and then taking that land for the future when Indigenous peoples are off their reserves. In 2015, Justin Trudeau committed to ending boil water advisories within the next 5 years. It has now been 10 years, and Indigenous people still face boil water advisories today. There are also legal cases arguing whether Canada should even be held responsible for Indigenous water, even though it is a basic human right. A national class action lawsuit kickstarted by a remote northern Manitoba First Nation in 2022 sparked lawyers to argue that Canada does not owe any legal obligations. This goes directly against the call to actions given to the government by the Indigenous peoples. Now, to be fair, it's not as if no change has been done since Trudeau's commitment. Water advisories has decreased over the years, with rates from the past 4 years dropping from 99 to 35. The necessary capital investment in order to fix the problem is a whopping $3.2 billion. An Indigenous-owned private sector firm pegs the figure even higher, at $4.7 billion, based on higher population growth assumptions. The call to action associated with this issue is number 20, which states that Canada should, quote, "recognize, respect, and address the distinctive health needs of the Métis, Inuit, and off-reserve Aboriginal peoples." Clearly, the Canadian government have made false promises and goals that were never achieved. While work has been done before, shown in the Neskantaga case, where government testing showed that the upgraded treatment facility has been producing clean, safe water, many of the residents still report issues with it, showing deep scars where they took baths. But what can you do about this? The best thing you can do today is to share stories surrounding Indigenous issues, and not only inform yourself, but others around you as well. In the description, we have linked news articles and websites that include more detailed information, and we hope that you take some time out of your day and view them. Right now, we may not see change, but that could change in the future.